Didn't your mama teach you any manners? Seriously, what are you thinking doing some of these things at the poker table? I mean, okay, I know that there isn't a rule against it, but still, you should know better, right? I'm Steve Wannall, your poker guru, and on this edition of the Tavern Poker Podcast, we are talking about the unspoken rules of conduct. The unwritten rules. The things that no one expressly says you can and cannot do while you're in a poker tournament or at a cash game, but you should know them and adhere to them anyway, because everyone expects it. That's right, we are talking about poker etiquette. Now, before I specifically get into poker etiquette, I think I need to define the term etiquette by itself. Now, it's a little absurd that in the 21st century we would have to tell people what etiquette is, but if our society has proven anything, it's that people need to relearn what etiquette is. Now, of course, oftentimes we confuse it with simply being polite or having manners, but the specific term etiquette goes a little bit beyond that. Dictionary.com defines etiquette as the customary code of polite behavior in society or among members of a particular profession or group. For example, a poker table. And again, often the rules of poker etiquette are not something that you're going to find written down in any official rulebook. They're just something that's understood amongst regular players. Now, once you get involved in a poker tournament or a casino cash game, the first thing you tend to notice is that there are a lot of rules. In fact, there are seemingly rules to govern just about everything. There are, of course, rules governing the operation of the game itself, for example, the order of hand rankings and the order of play around the table. But there are also rules governing how the cards are dealt out, how a player is supposed to handle their chips, how betting and checking are supposed to happen. There are even rules governing what you can and cannot say while you're seated at the table. But when I talk about etiquette, I'm talking about something different. Now, according to the definition I just read, it's merely an accepted system of being polite to one another at the table. But not knowing what the specific unwritten rules of poker etiquette are could actually make your life somewhat miserable when you're up against seasoned poker professionals, or anyone who's spent any length of time with the game. Not adhering to poker etiquette could mean the difference between simply having a good time or not, or it could be the difference between getting into a fight or not. I have seen some seriously heated arguments erupt around the poker table simply on matters of the proper poker etiquette. So what is poker etiquette? Why is it so important? Why is it such an accepted part of the game? Why do so many people expect you to display it when you're at the poker table, even when these rules are not a part of the actual rules? Well, to figure this out, I had to break it down into several different categories. Because as it turns out, there are a lot of unwritten rules of poker etiquette. And while most of them do exist as guidelines to ensure that people are considerate of others at the table, a lot of them do really affect the way the game itself is played. So what are some of these categories I came up with? Well, the first category is something that I think governs something that we are all guilty of on occasion, which is a lapse in attention. I call this category simply pay attention. Now, with all of these categories, you will find instances where these things are covered in the rules in some way. But usually, these are additional unwritten rules that have been sort of molded or sculpted over time by the existing rules. And if you are breaking some of the rules in this category, you're not necessarily defying the rules of the game, but you're very likely irritating people at the table with you. For example, it's really important to act in turn. Now, when you first learn the game of poker, usually around somebody's kitchen table when you're a kid, there's all manner of sloppiness involved. Everybody will get dealt their cards, they'll take a look at them, decide they don't want to play them, and just throw them in willy-nilly. If someone wants to make a bet, they'll just grab a handful of chips and throw it in there and announce what they did, and then someone else will grab a handful of chips and call them, and everything will hit the pot all at the same time. But that's not how it works in any organized poker game. Acting in turn, and conversely not acting out of turn, becomes especially important. There is a specific time that everyone is supposed to act, and that is something that's talked about in the rules, but it's often overlooked when people break this rule in small little ways, because often it can simply be written off as a lapse in concentration, or someone not paying attention. That's why you're not usually going to get penalized by a tournament director or an official of the game in any capacity for doing these things unless it becomes a consistent problem. But it's not too difficult to find examples of why it's a problem to act out of turn, or to not act swiftly when it is your turn. There was a recent example from a pretty high-profile final table in a high-stakes tournament. I believe there were only 3 players remaining, and the blinds were very high, and the payouts at this point were likewise very high. So there was a lot at stake. There was a lot on the line. Now, in this tournament, where every elimination at this point meant literally the difference in a pay jump of hundreds of thousands of dollars, there was a player who went all in. There were 2 players behind him still to act. With the decision on the first player in that order, the second player mucked his cards out of turn. There was an immediate reaction from that player, realizing he'd made a mistake, but of course it was too late. His cards were in the muck. They could not be taken back. That is part of the official rules of the game. And of course, looking at his cards, he wasn't going to play them anyway, certainly not calling someone's all in. But the damage at that point had already been done. He had influenced the action. He was in a position where he was looking to ladder up. He desperately wanted another player to be eliminated before he was. And with a player acting ahead of him, who had not yet made a decision of whether to call or not, he knew that decision would be made easier if that player didn't have to worry about what the person next to him was going to do as well. Put yourself in the position of the first person to act. Somebody goes all in front of you. You have a decent but marginal hand, maybe something like a suited Queen-Jack or King-10. You have the all-in player covered by a fairly comfortable margin, and so you sense an opportunity to knock a player out of the tournament, but there's still a player to act to your left, and you don't know what they're going to do, whether they have woken up with a really strong hand or not. So what do you do in that situation? Do you make the call and hope that the player to your left folds so that you can go heads up with the all-in player? Of course, you could raise all-in yourself to try and isolate the all-in player, but then what happens if the player to your left does have a strong hand and decides to come along? And if you just call there, that player to your left might also call, generating a side pot, and now you have to play a hand against somebody else out of position, and you don't know what they're holding. So as you can see, it's not an automatic decision. It's actually fairly difficult, especially when the stakes are that high. But what if you knew you didn't have to worry about someone acting to your left? That the final decision was going to be on you? Well, that would make it a whole lot easier, wouldn't it? You know then that you can make that call without potentially putting your entire chip stack at risk. That's how much that player acting out of turn influenced the action at the table. And there was a lot of controversy about this. There were a lot of people going back and forth about whether the player who acted out of turn knew what he was doing, and he was just what we call angle shooting, and I'll get to that in a little bit, or whether or not it was a genuine mistake. Now, it is important to note that that player did not receive any penalty whatsoever for acting out of turn, because while acting in turn is specifically mentioned in the rules do allow for lapses in concentration, for instances where players might not be paying attention or might have missed something. And that's why that specific unwritten rule of etiquette exists. And in that category, it's also very important that you act swiftly. Now, it's not fair to rush somebody through a hand. That's some etiquette as well. If someone has a difficult decision to make at the table, you want to afford them the courtesy of the time to think it through, because it can be a very big decision. And no one wants to be rushed into making a decision that could potentially mean their tournament life. And you would certainly hope that people afford you that same consideration if you're the one with the tough decision. That being said, it is very important that you not delay the game, especially in a tournament where there's a blind clock constantly ticking down, where those blind levels are increasing at regular intervals, and the short stacks are going to get shorter and shorter every time the new level comes up. Now, mostly people are pretty good about that. But in recent years, people tended to abuse the fact that the rules were fairly lenient on the amount of time giving people to make a decision. So first, they instituted rules where you could call a clock on someone, at which point the pit boss would give a player a certain amount of time to act, or their hand would be folded. And even more recently, there are a lot of tournaments that now have what we call shot clocks. The moment the action is on you, you have a predetermined amount of time within which to act. And it's kind of a little sad that this has become necessary, because people were abusing the rules. They were eating up time. A lot of times, if it was a high-profile tournament on television, they were just kind of acting it up for the camera, or just holding court at the table, or trying to get information on somebody by doing a whole lot of talking instead of genuinely thinking out what they were going to do. And that sort of leads into the next category of etiquette that I'd like to talk about, which is Hollywooding. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, Hollywooding simply refers to putting on a show at the poker table. It's usually done with the intention of fooling your opponent in some way, or specifically molding your table image into that of a more mysterious player, and it can take the form of doing things like pretending to have a really hard time making a decision that you've already made, and is in fact very, very easy, but you don't want your opponent to know that it's easy. So you pretend to agonize over the decision. You've already decided you're going to fold, but you're going to sit there and act for a while. You're going to pause. You're going to eat up the clock for a bit, because you want your opponent to think that you're a lot stronger than you actually are. Hollywooding is generally harmless, and of course you're not going to find any official rules governing Hollywooding in general, but taken to the extreme, it does start to blend into actual rules. Rules specifically governing how you might influence the action at the table, which is why it's really important not to talk about the hand that is in progress. And sometimes Hollywooding doesn't really involve someone deliberately putting on a show, but they're putting on a show all the same. They're acting in a certain way. They're saying certain things at the table that are designed to sort of get attention, not thinking about the effect that it has on the players who are still active in the hand. For example, have you ever seen a player fold and then watch a flop hit the table and it's all spades and they'll react like, "Aw, man!" Well, they just announced to the entire table that they would have flopped a flush had they stayed in. And at first glance, this seems fairly harmless. After all, they're not involved in the hand anymore. They can't win the pot. Who cares if they had a flush or not? Well, for the players who are still involved in the hand and are paying even the slightest bit of attention, it probably matters quite a bit, especially if you happen to be in the middle of a bluff where you're trying to get your opponent to think that you might have that flush. If your opponent in that scenario knows there is someone not involved in the hand who actually had the flush, it makes it that much less likely that someone they are in the hand with now does as well. It influences the action unnecessarily, and all because someone was inadvertently Hollywooding. They were trying to get people to pay attention to them. They were trying to get people to commiserate with their misfortune. This can also take the form of people showing somebody else who's not involved in the hand their cards right before folding them. Well, that seems like a pretty innocuous mistake as well, but it usually alerts everybody at the table to see what I'm folding, see how strong it is, or see how good the draw I have is that I'm letting go of. It gives an unfair advantage to somebody. And think of it this way, even if you're not involved in the hand, why would you want to be giving that kind of information to your opponents? And if you're deliberately trying to give that kind of information to someone, well, then it starts to blend into that term that I used a little bit earlier, which is angle shooting. And I list that in this category because angle shooting, in a sense, is a form of Hollywooding. It's putting on an act to try and manipulate the rules in such a way that you can gain an advantage from it. Now, some forms of angle shooting are relatively harmless. These are going to be things like someone making a big show of counting out a big, huge stack of chips right before they check. But sometimes it can force a person into making a move that they otherwise would not have made. And the most common form of this is something like the fake bet, or what I like to call the pump fake. This is where someone takes a handful of chips and starts moving them forward, perhaps holding them in midair towards the betting line, making a motion like they're going to make a big, huge bet, or call an all-in, but then at the last second pulling it back into their stack. And they're always doing this so they can get some kind of a read on their opponent, maybe even get them to turn their cards over prematurely. Other forms of angle shooting include, quote-unquote, accidentally exposing your cards while you're folding. This is usually done to give information to the people left to act behind you in the action, so they'll get a better idea of whether or not they should call somebody's big bet, which, as in the example I gave before, might help somebody ladder up in a tournament. Or it could also be considered a form of collusion, which I include as bad etiquette, even though that is specifically stated in the rules that collusion is illegal. But perhaps the most egregious form of Hollywooding is something that makes a lot of poker players' blood boil, my own included, and I'm generally pretty unflappable. And that is the slow roll. Now, if you're new to the game and you've heard the term slow roll before but haven't really heard it defined, let me explain it's not the same as slow playing. Slow playing usually means you have a really monster starting hand, or you've got a really good made hand, and you're pretending to be weak. You're not betting, you're just checking, but then you come over the top. You're trapping someone. That's an accepted strategy. There's nothing wrong with slow playing a hand. Believe me, I do it all the time. Slow rolling, however, is very different. When a player slow rolls, it means they've already won the hand, and they know they've won the hand. They may even know that they've got it locked up well before the hand finishes because they flopped the nuts or something. But instead of just revealing their hand at the showdown and letting everybody off the hook, they're going to make a big show of turning it over really, really slow or with a grand flourish, all to sort of rub it in. And that's just poor sportsmanship. A lot of people do this all the time because they like to feel like they outplayed their opponent. They like to feel superior to the people that they just beat, and they want everybody to see that they just beat that person. Even if they had nothing to do with it, even if it was just pure blind luck that allowed them to win the hand, they still want to make a big show out of everybody seeing that they outplayed their opponent, and therefore making a big act out of it. Well, that's just childish. Don't do it. It's bad form. And again, there's nothing specifically in the rules to prevent people from doing this. After all, that's something that's really hard to enforce. There are general rules governing sportsmanship and a player's conduct at the table, and a lot of the times this is left to a tournament director's discretion, but slow rolling itself is not specifically mentioned, and it's not something that people are usually going to get called out on in any kind of official capacity, unless it's the sort of thing that is so egregious and so over the top that it's outright taunting or being abusive. And I can think of an example where that might have been the case. A number of years ago, there was a very high-profile, very high-stakes poker tournament that happened in Europe, I forget which country, but it had perhaps one of the worst slow rolls of all time. They were down to the final table, 6 players remaining, I believe, and the short stack at the table looked down at his cards and figured, well, this was the best moment he was going to get to try and put it all in. And so he did. And the action folded around to one more player left to act. And that player took a peek at his hole cards and called for time. Now, calling for time is something that works differently depending on the rules of whatever tournament you happen to be involved in or what league you're playing in, etc., etc. But in this particular tournament, any player could call a clock on another player, anybody could call for time if they needed that time to try and come to a decision. Now, it's hard to imagine anything like this happening nowadays, but this player calling for time was awarded a full 5 minutes to make a decision. And at first glance, that's really not such a terrible thing. I mean, this is pretty high-stakes poker. Someone was all in for their tournament life, and while this player did have them covered, it could be a big chunk of their chip stack that they don't want to risk losing. It's a big decision to make. But this player, after calling for time, got up from the table and walked out of the room. He went over to the bar, got a drink. He used up the full 5 minutes before coming back, casually sitting down at the table, waiting for the rest of that clock to run out, and then gleefully declaring, "I call," and turning over the pocket aces that he was holding. That, to me, goes beyond a simple slow roll. That is absolutely obnoxious. This player knew the moment he glanced at those aces that he was going to be making that call. It doesn't make any sense for him to have done anything else in that situation. But he wanted to slow roll. He wanted to rub it in. He wanted to torture this player, knowing that in all likelihood he was going to get knocked out of the tournament. And so, instead of just being a gracious winner and tabling his hand right away after announcing a call, now he called for a clock and left the room, and let his poor opponent sweat for 5 whole minutes. Sadly, karma was not on everybody else's side that day, as the aces did hold up and that player was eliminated in 6th place. And of course, because there's no specific rule governing slow rolling, There was no penalty for what the player did. In fact, he called for time, which was allowed in the rules. Everything he did was specifically allowed by the rules. But it was expressly against poker etiquette. Make no mistake, this player was vilified by the poker community afterward. There were articles written about what an awful thing this guy had done and how terrible a poker player he was. People hated him after that. And it didn't have anything to do with him outplaying his opponent. He simply woke up with the best possible starting hand when another player was all in. So even if they had had a history at the table together of going back and forth and this guy really wanted to make it known that he had outplayed his opponent, he couldn't even make that claim. He didn't outplay him. It was just blind luck. So in the future, if you find yourself in that situation, if you find yourself sitting with a really strong hand and you know beyond a shadow of a doubt you're going to win the hand and someone goes all in and turns over their cards, don't be a jerk. Don't slow roll. If you find yourself wanting to slow roll, stop. Just don't. Because even if you don't happen to like the person that you were up against in that hand, you're not going to make any friends from the other players at the table either. And that brings me to the next category, which I've labeled politeness. Now, this is something that's really at the heart of etiquette in general. It's all about governing a way of being polite to people. It's coming up with a system to ensure that people are addressing each other with proper manners. And being polite to people is certainly not something that's expressly written down in the rules, but this more goes along the line of general etiquette. You don't have to be at a poker table necessarily to really take any of these to heart in any kind of situation as a form of etiquette. Now, of course, this category includes such things as being a gracious winner or a gracious loser, not being disruptive at the table, like being too loud or being physically intimidating. Also in this category, I say don't swear or curse at the poker table. Now, obviously, there's a little room to maneuver there. If you happen to know everybody at the poker table really well and you know they're not going to be offended by it, and you have a natural shorthand with them that involves a whole bunch of curse words, that's generally fine. Nobody cares if you're doing it around your kitchen table. A lot of times people don't even care if you're at your own table in a casino, but you're not being really loud with it. You're just conversing with the people there in front of you and nobody cares. And I personally subscribe to the theory that there's no such thing as a bad word, really only bad intentions behind them. That being said, however, I like to tell poker players the same thing I try to teach my children, which is simply know your audience. Know who might be listening into your conversation and the things that you say. And be respectful of the fact that maybe not everybody appreciates it. There are going to be some people who are offended by it. Certain behaviors might not be offensive to you, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't respect others. And there are certainly some cases where that is going to be a part of the rules. Loud profanity definitely falls under the purview of disruptive behavior that could be penalized at the tournament director's discretion. And along those lines, something else that's really important, you shouldn't berate the other players at the table. Now, this one tends to be hard for a lot of people. Even someone as patient and easygoing as myself, I can sometimes find myself talking to the other players in the tone of like, why would you do that? Or what were you thinking? Or how could you make that call? And generally, I'm asking a serious question, but sometimes the tone can be, a little scolding because what they just did doesn't make sense to us. And of course, it's usually after we've been negatively affected by it. People who are serious about playing games tend to get really wrapped up in it. And for those of us who are really deep into the strategy of it, it's one thing if we feel we've been outplayed by someone. It's quite another if it feels like they did something terribly, terribly wrong or against all logic and still ended up beating us. But it really doesn't do you any good to berate the players in that situation. Not only could it be considered rude and combative, it's something that could start arguments and heated discussions at the table, but there's another practical reason why you shouldn't do it. And I think this makes a lot of sense. Usually when you're berating another player, it's for their play. It's for how badly you think they're playing the game. And while that may make a person very defensive and argumentative with you, it does something else that you perhaps don't want to have happen, which is it educates them on how to play the game against you. Berating the other players at the table is also giving them information, valuable information. And information at the poker table is a valuable commodity. It's not something you want to just give people for free, because they will use it against you. Now, sometimes you might be able to convince yourself that this is an outcome that you want. You want them to be afraid to play against you. You want them to fold when they're against you because, they're afraid of the tirade that might come if they get involved in a hand with you again. But more than likely, it's going to do you more harm than good, and it does kind of muddy the waters of politeness at the table. It puts everybody on edge, makes everybody uncomfortable, and there's no reason to do that. And the last little thing of politeness that I'd like to touch on is something that also tends to rise out of people being butthurt. And I've seen this in a lot of different games. I've seen this in a whole lot of... I play a lot of different games, not just poker. And invariably, when someone's having a really rough time of it in a game, I will almost always hear somebody accuse somebody else of cheating. Now, oftentimes, they're not being totally serious. They're just frustrated. They don't understand how they could be losing. They don't understand how this could have happened to them. And in their mind, the only possible explanation is that they must be getting cheated somehow. Somebody must be cheating to be doing as well when they're doing the exact same thing as you, and they're winning and you're losing. But it's really important to consider something here. Accusing someone of cheating, even if it's just in a game with nothing on the line, that's a very serious accusation. That is effectively accusing someone of a crime. And no one likes being accused of cheating. Now, of course, if someone actually is cheating, they're certainly going to deny it. They're going to act all offended because, how dare you call them out on something that they absolutely did? But you can't just accuse someone of cheating without hard proof, without having specifically witnessed exactly what they did that you think is against the rules. And if you're not sure, if you just sense that something not above board is happening, then the best thing to do is get a tournament organizer involved. Get the dealer involved. Get the pit boss involved. Get a tournament director involved. Ask questions. Don't just leap right to an accusation. Because believe me, whether they are cheating or not, that's going to cause a problem. And of course, the next natural extension to this, and it should go without saying, don't cheat. If you're in a casino and you're cheating, you're going to get caught. Virtually no one gets away with it in that kind of a setting. Not even in this day of modern technology where playing cards are fitted with microchips that can tell you what they are, and you can read it on an app on your phone, and the chips at the table also have tracking devices in them. There's eye-in-the-sky cameras everywhere. People can figure out how to abuse these things or use them to their advantage, but they always end up getting caught. And if you're not in a casino, if you're at a home game or a tavern league or just playing with your friends and the stakes are pretty low, what are you doing cheating anyway? There's lots of easy ways to make money out there. Making money by playing poker is already kind of cheating the system. And if there's no money on the line, then what are you doing? Is your ego really that fragile that you have to cheat just to make it look like you're better than everybody else in your social circle? Of course, this starts to stray away from poker etiquette and into the realm of actually breaking the rules, but the etiquette part is simply in making the decision to govern your own behavior. Making a promise to yourself that you're going to be a better person than that. Because the longer you play poker, inevitably you're going to find yourself in a situation somewhere where you discover that it is possible for you to break the rules. You will find yourself in some situation where breaking a certain rule is feasible. Maybe someone's not paying attention to someone. Maybe there's a circumstance in the particular game that you're in that you realize you can exploit. And all I can say to that is, don't do it. You're already playing poker at that moment instead of doing something productive for the rest of society. There's no reason to top that by being unscrupulous. And speaking about the rules, that's a nice segue into the next category in this list, which I simply refer to as know the rules. Now, by the time we get into a poker tournament or find ourselves playing at a cash table in a casino, we're already pretty familiar with how the game goes. We know that we post blinds, we know that we get dealt cards and there's a betting round, and that you should probably act in turn. You know how the betting works. But inevitably you'll discover that there are 100 little rules that you probably don't have down by rote. There's lots of minutia when it comes to playing cards at a table. And most of these things will actually be covered in the rules, but you're not going to get penalized for breaking them because you're going to get a lot of rope. You're going to be given a lot of slack when it comes to most of these things. And most of them are things that it's just sort of expected for you to understand. And in many cases, while there are certain actions that they will call you out on in a casino, when you're in a different kind of game, a more casual game, things might be more lenient, but you should still understand them anyway, out of consideration for the people that you're playing with. And these include things like string betting. Now, a string bet is what happens when you take, say, a handful of chips and you move them across the betting line and into the center of the table as a bet, and then you let go of them and you reach back to your chip stack to grab some more and add it to the original bet. Now, without any kind of verbal declaration of how much you're betting, that's going to be an illegal move in just about every poker game. You can't string multiple bets together like that, because it gives you sort of an unfair advantage. It gives you that moment of pause where people might give you a reaction, or they might start making a call or announce a call before your bet is even finished. It leads to confusion. And when there is confusion and people's money is on the line, that's never a good thing. Now, a specific form of string betting also involves calling, how you're responding to an action. And this is a pet peeve of mine that I've had for quite some time, because in addition to being a poker guru, I also happen to be a professional actor and a lover of theater and movies and television and acting in general. And this is something I see in any kind of performance where there is any kind of poker played. And they almost always get it wrong. And I'll set the scene for you. Let's say there's a super spy or maybe a rugged cowboy, and they're sitting at a poker table in a smoky room, and the plot has been building up to this point for quite some time in the story. And in addition to the poker game, there's something else at stake between the players at the table, something that's much higher stakes than just the money they're playing for. And the tension is building and building, and you don't know what's going to happen in this hand, but this hand could decide everything, the whole fate of the story, and someone will make a big move, and then it cuts to our hero who will say, "I'll call your bet and raise you this much." Well, anybody who's played poker for any length of time will tell you, no, you can't do that. That's totally illegal. Verbal declarations are binding at the poker table. So you have to be very careful about exactly what you say. This is why that first category of paying attention is so important. If someone makes a big bet in front of you, and you say, "I will call your $500,000 and raise you another $500,000, well, no. They're going to go by the first thing you said, which is, "I will call." Once you say the words, "I call," raising is off the table. You are just calling a bet. Now, it's important to note that sometimes they'll say something, "I'll see your $500,000 and I'll raise you $500,000. Well, that's a little bit different. "I'll see" or "I see" is not a binding declaration. There are specific things that govern your actions at a poker table or in a poker tournament or in a cash game, and those are saying the words check, raise, call, even if you're the first one in and you just say bet. If you say the word bet, you still have the option to say an amount after that or to throw a number of chips into the center of the table, but simply saying the word bet has automatically committed you to the minimum bet at that point. But saying, "I see your bet," well, that's technically a little more open to interpretation, but it's still something you should avoid. And it's also kind of Hollywooding. So that's a big part of etiquette. In addition to knowing the rules, you should be very careful about how you present it. Make your actions very clear and distinctive. It's really important also to govern your physical actions at that point as well, because tapping the table in front of you is always a check. If checking is an option that is available to you and you tap the table in front of you when it is your turn to act, that is going to be interpreted as a check. And on that note, I'd like to relate one of the worst mistakes I've made in quite some time. It happened just a couple of weeks ago. We were having the big Maryland State Regional in the Tavern League that I play in, and I went out very early in that tournament. And that's not unusual. Sometimes you can play the best game of your life and you'll get it in good and things just aren't going to work out for you. But this happened to be a pretty unceremonious exit. And it happened because of a very unique and specific situation that I'm pretty sure I couldn't duplicate if I tried, but it also happened as a strange lapse in my own attention span. And I'll try and set this up as best as I can. I had already taken a pretty severe hit to my chip stack when my straight got beaten by a higher straight. It was an ugly beat. It didn't eliminate me from the tournament, but it took away a sizable chunk of my chip stack very early on in the tournament. Not a comfortable place to be sitting, but it made me realize, well, I'm going to have to do something drastic right away if I'm going to try and build this back up and last for another 5 or 6 hours. Well, it didn't take long for that moment to arrive. I was in the big blind, and I had a truly terrible hand. I mean, a real stinker. It was 6 deuce off suit. One of the worst possible starting hands. And I had to post a big blind. I had no choice in the matter. But luckily, there were a whole lot of limpers in the pot. Nobody raised. A lot of people put money in the pot, but it didn't cost me a thing to see a flop. I was already in for the big blind. When the action came around to me, all I had to do was check and see a free flop. And I did. On that flop, I paired my 6, which was really nothing to get excited about. It was bottom pair on that board, and I had no kicker with it, just a deuce. And there were easily 4 or 5 people left to act behind me. I wasn't about to risk my entire tournament life on that hand. So I just checked, and luckily, it checked all the way around. Nobody bet at it. Now, at that moment is where things kind of went off the rails. And here's where the situation is very unique. Before the turn card came out, the waitress at the establishment where the tournament was being held came over and asked me if I wanted to order food. As it turns out, I really did want to order food. It had been hours since I had eaten. I'd been looking forward to this person coming to the table for quite some time. It was a very big tournament and they were very, very busy, so you really had to grab the opportunity when they were there to take your order. I already knew what I was going to order, so I didn't have to spend much time away from the table. I didn't have to split my attention that much, but I turned and placed my order as quickly as I could. But apparently, during these few short seconds while my attention was diverted from the table, the turn card was dealt, and while I was talking to the waitress, I made some kind of physical gesture that ended with my hand tapping the table. In the meantime, that sent the action to the player to my left. That player to my left was deaf. He could not hear anything that was going on at the table, so he was going exclusively by hand gestures, and people clearly indicating to him that the action was now on him. And when my hand hit the table, that was a clear indication that I was passing the turn. So he checked as well. Another player checked. It checked all the way across the table from me until there were only 2 players to act left, when I turned and looked at the table and realized that the turn card paired my kicker. I now had 2 pair, 6s and deuces, but because my attention had been diverted from the table, I didn't notice that the action was already well past me. And so I grabbed all of my chips and I shoved them all in, thinking that the action was mine because I was first to act in the hand. Well, it was at that moment that everybody said, "Whoa, wait a minute. The action's not on you anymore, it's over here. You already checked." Now at that point, I had to roll back what had happened in my mind to try and figure out what they were talking about, because as far as I was concerned, a flop came out, I checked, everybody checked around, the waitress came over, I looked over and gave my order, turned back, saw the turn card, and my being the first to act, I made an all-in bet. But that's not how the rest of the table perceived it. They saw a hand motion from me that they interpreted as a check, and therefore the action had passed. So I did the only thing I could. I had to pull the bet back and let it come all the way back around. Well, as it turns out, everybody checked all the way to the river. Well, at that point, I'd pretty much made up my mind I wasn't going to get a better opportunity. I had to get it all in here regardless of what the river card was. Well, the river card was a queen, which didn't appear to change anything at all. There was no flush on the table, there was no straight possible on the table. My 2 pair looked pretty good. So, paying full attention, I put my whole chip stack in again, at which point I saw the deaf player to my left kind of sigh and shake his head, and he called me. Everyone else folded, and to my horror, he turned over Queen 6. He had called under the gun with Queen-6 offsuit, which is not something that's in my range, but I know how a lot of casual poker players play, even when something big like a Maryland State Regional is on the line. And just like me, they had paired their 6 on the flop. It was bottom pair. But the important thing to consider here is that when I inadvertently checked the turn, when I had 2 pair, at that point, I had the strongest hand, and my intention was to go all in with it. Now, there's no way of knowing if this player would have actually called me with his Queen-6 there or not. After all he had was a pair of 6s at that point, and he also had several people left to act behind him. It's very likely that he would have let it go. But by making the mistake that I did, I robbed myself of the chance to take the lead. And then, when I was already committed to pushing it all in with my 2 pair, he just so happened to river a higher 2 pair. And I was knocked out of the tournament. So not only is that a matter of paying attention being important, it's very, very important to understand the information that you are conveying. Know what it is that you're supposed to say. Know when the action is on you. Because if you don't realize the action is on you, and I've seen this happen before, I've seen someone being in the middle of a bad beat story, and the action will get to them, and they don't realize that it's their turn to act, and as part of the story they are telling, they will say the words all in. And if they are not careful, the dealer could interpret that as their action. Now, there are other little pieces of knowing the rules that kind of fall more on the etiquette side of things. Some of the main ones being that you should never argue over a hand. Just call the floor. Call the tournament director, call whoever's in charge and get a ruling. Don't try and sort it out right then and there because people are never going to agree because they both want to win the pot. You should also understand that if you show somebody your cards, you're supposed to show everybody your cards. As a general rule, you shouldn't show your cards, certainly not when the hand is still in progress. But if, say, you win a pot and you want to convey information to people by showing them what you had and letting them know that, yeah, I had a strong hand and you should always fold when you're in a pot against me. Yeah, well, that's perfectly acceptable strategy. But you can't just flash it to one opponent. You can't just show one person in the hand. Because even if no one played, they were still dealt cards. Everybody was in that hand at some point. And it is against the rules to convey information to one person and not everybody else. And in that same sort of area, if it comes down to a showdown, if you make a big bet and somebody calls you and there's no more action left, just show your cards. Show your cards at the showdown. I see so many people who will try and disguise their hand to try and get the other person to reveal their cards first. So maybe they can realize, hey, they're beat and they don't have to show their cards and they'll just muck them right away. To try and avoid giving them any kind of information whatsoever. They'll say things like, did you hit that king? Knowing that, or they'll say, if you've got an ace, you're good. That's a way to goad your opponent into showing their cards first when you're supposed to be the one who's showing their cards. Because you're the one who got called. I've seen moments where 2 players will get involved in a big pot together and then the river comes and there's no more action and they'll just sit there and stare at each other. No one will turn their hands over. They'll say, what do you got? And the other person will say, what do you got? And if I'm the one dealing, I'll just tell them flat out, look, if somebody wants to win the hand, you're going to have to table it. Turn your cards over. And here's something to consider. Yeah, I know you don't want to convey information to the other players at the table. But if you're really that ashamed to show the cards that you played, maybe you shouldn't have played them in the first place. Now, as sort of a subcategory to knowing the rules, this next one is simply about maintenance. Specifically, the maintenance of your cards and your chips. And again, a lot of this is governed in the rules, but there's going to be some leeway with it because, they're going to give you some room to maneuver as far as not understanding how certain rules work. But again, all of these rules of etiquette do exist for a reason, and some of them can be pretty important. And the first one I'd like to talk about in this category is splashing the pot. You'll hear people say this all the time, don't splash the pot. And sometimes you might not understand what it is they mean by that. Well, what it means is simply don't throw the chips into the middle with all the rest of the chips, because there's no way of knowing if you made the right call or not. There's no way of knowing if you put in the amount that you were supposed to put in. Never just throw your chips across the table. Never just throw them into the middle of a bunch of other chips, or to anybody else's chip stack for that matter. If you're going to commit chips to the pot, either as a bet or a call or a raise, whatever, put them in front of you where everybody can see them. Don't mix them with anything else. And keep them separate until the entire round of betting is finished. For people who have played poker for some time, this seems pretty obvious, but I see a lot of people who still make this mistake. They'll still just throw the chips right into the pot, and there's no way of knowing if what they just did was legit. Not splashing the pot also means don't start taking change before the action is done. Wait until the action is over. If you've got change coming to you, it'll get taken care of when the action is finished. Because if the action isn't finished and you've started taking change out of the pot, it starts to get confusing as to how much change you're owed, how much money was in there to begin with. Just wait. Wait until everything is done. Wait until everybody's done acting. Then the chips can be pushed into the pot. Then you can be given your change. And speaking of your chips, you should also make your chip stack amount identifiable. This is true of the bet that you put in front of you, but it's also true of just the stacks that you have that you're not betting. A lot of people don't like it if they think someone's eyeing up their chip stack, because it seems like an intimidation tactic, you know? Why are you eyeing my chip stack? You thinking of betting this exact amount? You're trying to target me? People will actually feel that. But the fact of the matter is, it's really important if you're being serious about poker strategy, you need to know exactly how many chips are in front of everybody, or at least have a general idea. If I'm late in a tournament, for example, and we're maybe approaching a money bubble or some kind of jump in the points or whatever, and I'm about to make a move, but I can see there's some stacks next to me that are likely to push all in because they don't have a whole lot, or maybe they have me really, really covered and I don't want to overcommit myself, it's really important for me to know exactly how much they're dealing with. Now, oftentimes, rules in that area can be pretty gray. There's sometimes, depending on where you are, there isn't really much to govern exactly how the chips in front of you should be. Some people are just going to keep a big random pile of chips in front of them. Some people are going to mix all their higher and lower value chips together. But they do have a right to know what is in front of you. Now, technically, you don't have to respond to them. If someone's asking you how much is in your chip stack, well, depending on the type of game you're in, they might not have to answer you at all. Maybe the dealer can let you know. That's usually not the case. But usually it's on you to take a look at it and get an idea. But as a simple matter of etiquette, don't be a jerk about it. Don't make it difficult for people to figure that out. Make your chips identifiable. Put the higher value chips on top of your stack, because there's generally going to be fewer of them. Even if you're doing well, you're generally going to have a whole lot more low-value chips than you are high-value chips, so it's important that those high-value chips are in plain view of everybody at the table. And if you don't like playing that way, if you do like mixing your chips up and shuffling them all together and building little statues out of them, if someone asks you how much you've got, be prepared to answer. Be prepared to show them. You don't have to keep it so close to the vest that you're going to be rude to people who are just asking a simple question. And while you might be in the mood to really kind of protect that information, to protect your chips at all cost, the real thing you should be concerned about protecting is your hole cards. Now, protecting your hole cards is almost always something that's included in the rules of any poker game. But the reason I list it here as part of poker etiquette is because it is something that is specifically on the player to understand. They're never going to penalize you for not protecting your hole cards, but there are certainly some terrible consequences that can come from you not doing so. There is a famous hand from the World Series of Poker where they were close to a money bubble, and there was a woman involved in the hand. I believe she was in the 10 seat. She was right next to the dealer, and she went all in. She put all of her chips into the center of the table. And while the dealer was going around collecting all of the folded hands, he inadvertently mucked her cards. He scooped them up with all the other mucked cards, and they were gone. That was it. Now, she immediately called him out on it and said, "Hey, wait a minute, you grabbed my hand." And they tried to reconstruct it. They tried to bring them back to her. However, the pit boss was called over. The tournament director was called. They sat there and they discussed it. And it is clearly stated in the rules that it is on the player to protect their hand at all costs. If the dealer could grab the cards away from you, then technically it's not the dealer's fault. Now, I'm sure the dealer felt awful about it because it proved to be a $10,000 mistake, because the ultimate ruling was that hand was dead. Those cards were folded, and the chips were surrendered to the pot. That poor woman was eliminated from that tournament. because she didn't have a hand on her cards, she didn't have a card protector on her cards, they weren't close enough to her, they were a little too far out where the dealer could grab them thinking that they were mucked. And it's really important to understand where your cards are going as well. Some people will definitely fold, but they'll do it way too aggressively, and it'll fly across the table and into somebody else's hand. That's another reason you should protect your cards, because you never know when another card could come out of nowhere and mix with yours, and if you didn't have them covered in some way or you didn't have a hand on them, well, your cards are going to be considered mucked. Now, this actually happened in a home game that I was involved in a few years ago, where it was a friendly game around somebody's kitchen table, but it was also kind of taken seriously because these were serious poker players, and they agreed ahead of time that they were going to go by official World Series of Poker rules. And there was a lot of contentious play happening at this table. And in one particular hand, one of the players deliberately folded his cards on top of another person's cards. It was not an accident. It was done deliberately because that player was not protecting their cards, and he knew the moment his cards touched theirs, both hands would be considered dead. So he dropped the cards on top of the other player's cards and said, World Series rules, they're both dead. And they abided by it because those were the World Series rules, but it definitely left a bad taste in everybody's mouth, and it became a very contentious poker game from that point on. Now, it should also be noted, I think, and this is something that didn't happen in this home game, but had I been there in some kind of tournament director capacity, I would have ruled it this way. Yes, both hands would have been dead in that scenario because the hand in question was not protected. However, the person deliberately dropping their cards on top of that other person's cards was also disruptive behavior, which can be penalized at a tournament director's discretion. If I'm a tournament director in that case, I would rule both hands dead, but then the player who deliberately mucked their cards on top of someone else's would have been given a lap. I would have let them sit out for a while. So be wary of your chips, be wary of your hole cards. That's what I mean by chip and card maintenance. Now, before I move on to the last category, I'd probably be remiss if I didn't once again reiterate something that I have talked about time and time again in this podcast, and that is bluffing an empty side pot. Whenever people bring up a conversation about poker etiquette, this topic almost always comes up, because it's so misunderstood. People think that the etiquette is if you're in a tournament and you have an all-in player, you just check it down. You always check it down because you're just trying to get that player out. Well, I believe in previous episodes I've demonstrated scenarios where that's not the case, where it is okay to bet into an empty side pot. I think it doesn't make any sense to bluff an empty side pot at all, and I've many times demonstrated why that's the case. But this is an important piece of poker etiquette that needs to be discussed over and over again because it is not something that is in the rules. It's an understanding that a lot of players have that you're trying to get a player out, you're trying to outlast other people, and more people involved in a hand against an all-in player means a better chance of getting that player out, but there is no rule that says you can't bet into an empty side pot. It just doesn't make any sense to do it if you don't know you have the best chance of winning that hand. And here's something else to consider. 2 or more players cannot technically agree to check down a hand. That's considered collusion. That is in the rules. Now, you can make sort of an unspoken pact there that no one's going to bet anymore, but you have to wait for each card to hit the table and then act. And you can't say to the dealer, we're both just going to check it down. You can't say things like that. You can't even really make that deal with the other players at the table, because again, it's considered collusion. And even if you did make that deal, there is absolutely nothing in the rules that says someone has to abide by that agreement. If you both agree to check it down before the flop even comes out, but then the river hits and somebody makes a big, huge bet, well, you might feel pretty cheated. You might feel tremendously slighted by the person who made an agreement with you. But the fact is, they're doing nothing against the rules. So you need to understand exactly what's going on in that scenario. Yes, you want to try and get a player out. Yes, you're also trying to build your chip stack. You're trying to find every opportunity you can to pad your stack so that you can get deeper into a tournament. So these are all things you have to keep in mind when you're in that situation, when there's a side pot that could be generated. You don't want to do something that's just going to keep the all-in player in, but you don't want to lose an opportunity either, and you don't want to do something that flirts with collusion. And so that brings us to our very last category in this discussion, which is just general etiquette. Now, these are things that I'm going to reiterate for the poker table, but they really apply to a lot of other things as well. And it's simply things like exercise good hygiene. If you're going to be playing in a poker game, you're going to be in very close quarters with a lot of people. You're all going to be crammed up next to each other. You're going to be rubbing elbows and knees, quite literally. You're going to be breathing each other's air. Be considerate of the other players and show up clean and smelling fresh. Make sure you shower, put on deodorant, brush your teeth, whatever you need to do to not be completely offensive at the table. Famous professional poker player and multiple main event winner, the late Stu Unger, was famous for doing things like ordering chili while he was sitting at the poker table so that he would have terrible gas and throw people off their game. But as clever as that might seem to you, there's really no need for that. Just be aware of how you might be perceived by the people around you, and that includes how you smell. Another important piece of etiquette, at least that's important to me, and it's for myself, it's of course not in the rules of poker, but it is a hard, fast rule for myself. I will not discuss politics or religion with anyone at the poker table. I am not apolitical. I will have wonderfully spirited, informed debates with people, but I will not do it at the poker table. Other general rules of poker etiquette include, specifically if you're in a cash game, a lot of people say, don't win big and then leave. You know, if you sit down at the table with just a little bit of money and then in just a few short hands, you wind up winning an enormous pot or two, and suddenly you've got a whole lot more money than you did, and then after only 10 minutes you get up and you take all those chips out of play and you leave and you cash them in. Well, again, there's nothing in the rules that says you can't do that, but you're definitely going to leave a bad taste in people's mouths. It's generally considered good etiquette if you win some big pots from people. You gotta stay at the table for a little while. Play the game. This isn't just about taking money from people, it's about playing the game of poker. It's just good etiquette to at least give them the chance to win some of it back, or to keep the money on the table. Other general rules of poker etiquette that I'd like to talk about specifically pertain to the dealer at the table. If you happen to have dedicated dealers for your home game, or your charity event, or your tavern league, that's great. They don't usually have those. You absolutely will find them in casinos, obviously. But even if you have the players dealing in the game itself, there's ways that you should and should not relate to the dealer. Specifically, don't blame the dealer for your misfortune at the table. I can't tell you how many poker games I have been in where people will start berating the dealer because the dealer didn't give them good cards. I'm pretty sure it's every game, in fact. Maybe even before the dealer has started putting things out, they're already starting. They'll say, all right, come on, give me some good cards now. Or they'll say things like, I don't like it when you deal. The last time you dealt me garbage. Or maybe it'll even happen during a changeover, when one dealer is getting up from the table and being replaced by another. And you'll hear somebody at the table say, well, I hope you deal better cards than that last guy did. I'm going to try and say this loud enough so the kids in the back can hear me. The dealer has no control over your fortunes at the poker table. They have no control over whether you're getting good cards or not. It is not on them. Stop blaming the dealer. And while you're at it, if you're in a casino or any other place that has a dealer that's doing hard work for you while you have fun playing poker, tip them. Tip them often, tip them well. Because believe me, I work as a professional dealer on occasion. They take a lot of crap from players. So be kind to your dealers, because that's just good etiquette. And of course, this is a much deeper discussion than what we've touched on here in this episode. Etiquette is a pretty broad subject, and there's a lot of areas where it could apply in a poker game. So I think really the best thing you can do, if it seems too daunting to you, if it seems like there's too much to remember or there's too many rules, too much minutia, then just try and remember what your mama taught you. Because at the end of the day, good manners don't cost a thing. And that's going to do it for this episode. But if you like what you hear, give me a like, hit the subscribe button, tell your friends about it, or if you'd like to see some real live tavern poker in action, you can catch me on our 3 times weekly live stream from Brews and Q's on the Boulevard in Glen Burnie, Maryland. Look for us online on the World Tavern Poker Maryland Facebook page. Or even better, find yourself a game and go play. Until next time, I'm Steve Wannall, your poker guru. This has been the Tavern Poker Podcast. Thank you for listening.